In this video, I'm going to show you what happens when our mind controls us instead of us controlling our mind. And if that sounds like a strange thing, then watch this video because I'm going to explain exactly what I mean, and it all relates to the ego. Hi, and welcome back to Mental Health Power. So, the ego is essentially your sense of identity. And this is a phrase that we'll hear in just normal language as well. I'm sure we hear the phrase saying someone's got a big ego, or that somebody is going on an ego trip or is egocentric. But what exactly is the ego in terms of our psychology and our minds? So essentially, the ego is our self-identity, so our self-image, you could say, and these stories that we have that define who we are, who we think defines us as a person. Essentially, it's made up of things that we completely identify with. So in many ways, you could see this almost like being another sub-personality. So I mentioned, for example, the inner child in the previous video, and I say how that is essentially like a sub-personality within us. The ego is another sub-personality, but it's something that is, I think, a lot more readily and easily recognizable once we learn how to do this. And so the purpose of the ego ultimately is to ensure that we have a separate identity from other people. So it ensures that we have a sense of who we are, what we like, what we dislike, what our own perspective is. It ultimately is also built up of the thoughts that we have of ourselves and the world around us, beliefs, concepts, and all the behaviors that come from that. So all of these things we essentially build a self-image from. Now, the problem is we can have a healthy ego or an unhealthy ego, and this is where phrases like being egocentric come from, or having a big ego come from. That's another way of saying somebody has an unhealthy ego, because essentially they're placing too much importance on their sense of identity, so too much importance on their own ego. Now, the biggest problem with the ego and having an inflated sense of identity, apart from us placing too much importance on our own identity compared to others, which you can imagine creates all kinds of problems, we actually are not our ego. And I know that might sound strange because I'm basically almost saying we're not our identity. But if you see my previous videos on depression, on depersonalization and anxiety, where I previously talk about the mindfulness practice of observing your thoughts, then you would know from that video that we are not our thoughts. So then if we expand that further, if we accept that we are not our thoughts, then ultimately we have to accept that we are not our ego. And so think about it this way. So this is based on my own model, the way I see it. So the ego, you could say, ultimately lies in the subconscious. So in my previous videos, I also talk about the conscious mind, subconscious mind. So just to summarize, a conscious mind, you could say, are the things that we can readily experience about our mind. So our ability to think and have trains of thoughts, our ability to recall memories and experience them. There are more things, but those are the main things you'll need to know to understand the ego. And the subconscious has all the things that are hidden from us in our mind. So in terms of understanding the ego, the subconscious contains basically core beliefs, old habits, things that we are not aware of about ourselves. So I did a video on the shadow, which is when I talk about there are aspects of our personality that we're not aware of, different parts to us, and how those reside in what we would call the shadow, and that's within the subconscious. So the ego is also, in a way, it's kind of like it exists in both the conscious and the subconscious mind. And this is why I think this, because if our ego is essentially our self-image, then our self-image is essentially a collection of thoughts and beliefs about ourselves. And we have thoughts and beliefs in the subconscious mind. So ego is in the subconscious mind because it's essentially our self-image and is made up of thoughts. So T for thoughts. And when you have lots of thoughts, you get beliefs. And when you have, let's say, a string of thoughts and beliefs, you essentially get a story about ourselves. So let's say S for story. So the ego is like a collection of all of these. And from what I've noticed from observing in mindfulness meditation for doing it for like 3 years now, I think it's about 3 years. When we get trains of thoughts and we can view in our conscious mind, so this is here, the eye represents our point of awareness. So when we have these trains of thoughts, really, unless we are actually actively generating these thoughts, and there is a subtle difference, when we're not actively generating thoughts, we will have thoughts coming in from the subconscious. And these can come from these basically are coming from old beliefs and the different parts of us, so in our shadow. If we're not aware of what these aspects of us are, then we see they're our shadow aspect. So we have the ego, and it's generating these thoughts. It comments, it judges, it compares based on these stories, so our identity, based on our likes, our dislikes, our preferences, that all stem from this identity. Now, this is normal as long as it's balanced. The biggest problem, though, that we have is when we start seeing these trains of thoughts, these stories. So imagine this is us and this is like the TV of our mind, right? So we're viewing these thoughts, these stories about ourselves, are essentially viewing the ego. That's essentially what we're doing. We're viewing the ego. So you could say it's almost like the ego is projecting onto like a cinema screen, almost like that. This is how I view it. And then we're watching this on the screen, these thoughts, these stories coming from the ego, which are made up of these thoughts, beliefs, and stories about ourselves. And then we are completely identifying and believing that this is us. So we're completely believing that's our identity. But if we accept, like I mentioned in the previous video, that we are not our thoughts, we can observe them, and our thoughts can come from old self-images and old beliefs that we were brought up with, things that we were told, let's say as children, and we believed, or our society has told us and we've taken on and believed it. You can see where this creates problems, because if we truly believe that we are this ego, this identity, this can create a lot of suffering, because this ego can create all kinds of negative thoughts about us. And so if we fully identify with the ego, then we're identifying with something that actually might not be true at all. And this is also because it creates thoughts, beliefs, and stories really only about the past and the future. The ego can never stay in the present moment. So whenever we are identified with the ego, we are essentially stuck in the past or in the future. So don't forget that the past doesn't exist and the future doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is the present moment, because the past is just us bringing back memories. And the future is our mind creating possible scenarios. So the past and the future only exist in the mind. And the ego comes in to create past stories and future stories based on our identity. So when we completely believe these things, you can imagine how many problems this creates, because it entirely depends on how identified we are with the ego, but also the kind of things the ego is saying. So if you have a healthy ego, then you can have thoughts coming in about yourself, about your world, about what you believe about yourself, but they can be fine, they can be neutral, as long as you keep it in check. But if you don't have control over your ego, and if you're totally identified with it, and if your ego over time has been formed from really negative experiences, then we identify with the negative experiences and believe it's us. You can see where depression comes from if the ego focuses so much on the past. So you can see where anxiety comes from if the ego focuses so much on the future. So when we learn to stay present in the moment, we observe our thoughts and we see where they're coming from. We don't just believe them, and we can see, are these really balanced, helpful things? That is when we stay in the present moment, and we can see a lot of these fears we have, or the thoughts we have of our past that we're using to define ourselves, are in many ways a fiction, because a lot of the time they're just reinforcing negative beliefs we've held from the past that are not true about ourselves. And so how do you know whether you're experiencing your ego? So this actually links into the inner child, because the inner child also exists. So let's say I see for inner child. The inner child essentially also exists in the subconscious. And what you'll find is when we get that triggering feeling, so I mentioned in my other video, if we have a disproportionate reaction to something and it doesn't match what is actually happening, so we'll get that emotional trigger, let's say anger usually, or we feel hurt in some way. If we notice an immediate reaction, a complete reaction where we just start talking in a defensive kind of way, even in a subtle defensive way, a lot of the time it's because the inner child has been triggered, so that previous wound has been triggered. So now the ego, it's one of its main functions, apart from creating a sense of identity for us, its other purpose is to defend this inner child wound, or the inner child wounds if there are multiple ones. So you can see, as an example, how often the wounds we have from the past create an ego identity that we identify with. So example I've seen a long time ago, but I think it's a good example. You can have, let's say you have somebody who is really into football and they really, really love their football team. I'm personally not into football, but it's just a good example. Let's say there's someone else from a rival team, and let's say they just say to them something that makes the person, let's say they just say, oh, your football team is rubbish or something, or they say something that this person feels invalidates the fact that they like their team. And if their reaction is so over the top, and I'm sure this is not uncommon, where somebody says something about the football team and they get really reactionary about it and really defensive, well, most likely, let's say there's an inner child wound that's been triggered, because let's say as a kid, they didn't feel a sense of belonging from their family, as an example. And so supporting a football team or something similar could have been a way to gain that unmet need, to feel a sense of belonging. And so now there is an identity formed around this in the football team. So there are stories, the ego is telling them and they're believing it. And so now that person has triggered the wound, because not just saying, I don't like your team. What they're basically saying is, your sense of belonging is invalid. That's the interpretation coming, because the ego is picking up, oh, this inner child has been hurt. So that's another function. So now that I've said that, you may notice how this is really common. When we've all done this to certain extents, it depends on how balanced your ego is. So the ego is a massive, massive topic. There are essentially multiple different levels of your ego's evolution, or you could say really devolution, if you want. That's another way of looking at it, because you're essentially on the process of disidentifying with the ego. Because the problem really starts when we're not here, but we are like here, like glued to the screen that the ego is playing, projecting on, and we think that ourselves. That's where the problem really starts. And that's where so many mental health problems start, and just relationship problems can start as well. And so if this person in the example was able to start disidentifying with their ego, then let's say they feel the emotional wound. Oh, okay, my sense of belonging I didn't have as a kid, that need is still not fully met. Oh, now I can feel this being triggered. Okay, well, they can start then witnessing the stories the ego is putting up, like, who does this person think they are? How dare they say my team is rubbish? But they know, right, it's not really about the team, it's about the sense of identity and belonging I get from liking this team, from supporting this team. And so then they can watch their ego, they can observe it, they can understand this inner child wound, and then they can react in a more balanced way. So not reacting, being over the top, and I'm sure this is a common thing that we see when people get identified and attached to certain groups, for example, that this kind of thing happens. And this is normal. I know, it's just what happens, but it doesn't have to be that way once we gain this kind of awareness. So thank you for watching. Hit the like button if this has helped you. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.